piece, you do very interesting work. So I want to get to the Mexican slavery piece because I don't think in North America we think of slavery beyond much about what we did or what happened in the islands before liberation, and yet there's a sadness to the story in Mexico that's just as profound as ours.
Oh yeah, well there's this curious difference between the two slaveries, that the two systems of slavery. The Spaniards, when Cortez conquered Mexico, they had a very hip attitude toward slavery, that they didn't buy slaves from Africa or anything. They would just enslave the native population. They even did that in Europe when they conquered a European country. And so when they conquered Mexico, there were over 30 million indigenous people living in Mexico, and a lot of them, the Spaniards killed a lot of them inadvertently through the diseases, smallpox, measles, right, whatever. But they also in 1565, the Spaniards had a silver strike called El Rufo, and they discovered almost overnight that Mexico was one gigantic mountain of silver. And as soon as they discovered that, the days were numbered for the native population, and they just enslaved them. They had no rights. They just enslaved them promiscuously into the silver mines, the gold mines, in the different haciendas, and worked them to death in the fields. And within about less than 100 years from that moment, they had reduced the indigenous population from over 30 million down to less than 1 million. And they were in the process of going extinct. And the Catholic Church, which had been relatively cruel in their attitude toward colonization, they actually intervened. And they said, these people that, we may not think much of them, but they've got souls to be saved for Jesus. Therefore, there was no penalty for killing Indians. And they said, you're not allowed to kill Indians for no reason at all anymore. And you cannot work them to death in your fields and your mines. So that but at that point, the Spaniards had basically raped anything that stood still long enough, and they had a very large mestizo population.
Well, let's hold on to that thought right there, and we'll come right back, because the story you're already telling intersects with some other popular movies which tell at least part of that story too. But I want to get to the full story of the lingering part of Mexican slavery too next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnett. You know what we're talking about, at least in part here for this conversation with Bob Gleason, involves his new book. And it focuses, at least in part, on Mexican slavery. So we're talking about something which, perhaps it, perhaps you have some unique insight to this from personal experience in terms of your family history, or that's something that you've studied. But otherwise, when we talk about slavery in North America, it's pretty much focused on what the U.S. had done and its unique way of doing slavery. And Bob Gleason started this conversation by saying there was a differentiation between American slavery and Mexican slavery. And I want to get back to that, and we'll do it next. On Coast to Coast AM, this is Ian Punnett. Talking with Robert Gleason and the new book, Dead Men Don't Tell Lies. But Mexican slavery here being the core of the conversation, and we'll get back to a couple of the other threads of Bob Gleason's research I want to ask him about before we get to phones and bring you into the conversation too. But I want to pause that for just a second, and I want to say, part of how I reference what you're writing about was through the movie Apocalypto, the Mel Gibson movie, which I thought was excellent.
Movie. Yeah,
I thought
great movie.
It was, even though they compressed the timeline a little bit, and even though there were certain dramatic compromises that had to be made, I thought it was super effective. And it was I'm going to ruin the ending for people who've never seen it, but it was a very misinterpreted ending, where because of some there was some hard feelings still about Mel Gibson. I think fairly well placed in many regard, but there were some things that Mel Gibson had done which had gotten him a less than favorable view from a lot of critics, and so they were very harsh about the ending of the arrival of the Spaniards to the shores after all of the events that take place in Apocalypto. And some people said, "Oh, this is Mel Gibson making a case for here comes the West to save the indigenous people from themselves, and this is his version of particularly Catholicism saves the world." And I didn't get that at all. Even